it is strategic. It's amplified through public perception and enforced by systems of power. These tactics are effective not because they're rooted in truth, but because they exploit human psychology. They exploit social dynamics and how we engage and interact with each other. And they also exploit institutional authority, which is there for our protection. This type of emotional framing, it makes people more reactive and less discerning. What do Nehemiah, Jeremiah, and Jesus have in common? They were all lied on. They were accused of crimes that they did not commit. They were misrepresented by the very people that they were called to help in some of these instances. And their enemies didn't just, like whisper lies amongst each other. No, they weaponized public opinion, manipulated systems of power to silence them, and they tried to bury their mission beneath slander and shame. But here's the truth. When God appoints you, no one and no lie can unseat you. In today's episode, I'm exposing one of Satan's most deceptive and unfortunately effective weapons. It's one of the oldest strategies that he uses against God's people. What is it, you ask? It's slander. We'll look at how it works, why it's so effective, and how God ultimately defends his own. Honestly, this episode is one of the only times in my life where I have felt like I am behind on God's timetable, like in real time. I've known that I needed to do this, and so many things have come up between, but I pray that this message gets in front of everyone who needs to hear it. In the last episode, we looked at how large groups of people were on the wrong side of history, both in culture and in the church. And we ended that episode by exploring what it's going to take in order for us to make sure that we don't miss the next move of God. If you haven't heard that episode, then I suggest you start there and then meet me back here afterwards. Listen, I'm going to take my time with this episode because this one is a warning against a time to come. Well, honestly, it looks like we're headed in that direction now. But here's where we're going in this episode. So we're going to look at some biblical examples of where slander was used against a man of God. Then we're going to extract a 5-point methodology that's used by Satan in each example. Yes, he did. He ran the same play over and over and over, and it worked so well that he's still running it today. Then we'll take a look at why each method is effective and what the method is used for. We'll end this episode with looking at what we should do now that we have this information. Ready? Let's get started. Before we get into the first point, I want to make sure that we're on the same page regarding what actually qualifies as slander. A good place to start is with defining a term. Of course, I have multiple definitions, but we're going to start with Merriam-Webster. So according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, slander is the utterance of false charges or misrepresentations which defame and damage another's reputation. So in order for a false statement to qualify as slander, it must be said out loud. False statements that are written down are not slander. They're something else entirely. The Greek word for slander that's used in scripture is the word blasphemia. The definition of this Greek word means speech that is injurious to another's good name. Okay, so now let's look at the last part of the definition of slander that we got from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. This part of the definition shows us that not all spoken false statements are slander. Only the ones that damage someone's reputation will be considered slander. Based on this definition, there are a lot of examples of slander being used in the Bible to attack true servants of God. So we're going to look at 3 in this episode. Up first is Jeremiah. So the rundown of this scenario is in Jeremiah chapters 37 and 38. But here's what happened. Jeremiah was in a season during this time where he had been giving really serious and very convicting prophetic words from God. It all started when King Zedekiah of Judah sent some of his officials to Jeremiah with the request that Jeremiah pray to God on their behalf. So at this time, the people of Judah were in a time of war where the Babylonians were marching down. They were marching down from the north in order to attack them. The Babylonian army was a very mighty force to be reckoned with. Like, they were not to be played with. So we have Judah down here, the Babylonian army marching down, but then Pharaoh in Egypt, they had also began their journey to come down in order to assist Judah, which ultimately caused the Babylonian army to retreat. So they pretty much left Jerusalem because they didn't want that smoke either. So it's during this little lull in the battle that King Zedekiah of Judah is asking Jeremiah, what thus says the Lord. So everybody has retreated to their respective places. Judah is left alone, okay? So Jeremiah, he does it. He goes and inquires, and God tells him, tell Judah's king that Pharaoh's army, that army that came to help him, well, they're going to go back to their own land in Egypt. And when they do, the Babylonian army is going to return to Judah. They're going to fight against the people of Judah. They're going to capture the city, and they're going to burn it. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being the king of Judah hearing this? He's like, well, nah, my people here, they're helping me from Egypt. It's going to be fine. It's going to be good. The Babylonians not ever coming back. And you have the prophet of God who you asked to go and pray to God on your behalf, coming and saying basically that you're about to be annihilated once these people go back to Egypt. Well, after Jeremiah delivered this word, he ended up traveling to the land of Benjamin. Now, why did he go there? Well, back in chapter 32, God told Jeremiah that his cousin was going to come to him and tell him to buy his land, which was located in the land of Benjamin. His cousin was coming and offering Jeremiah the option to purchase his land because Jeremiah owned what's called the right of inheritance and redemption to that particular land. That means that land can't be sold before Jeremiah is given an option and an opportunity to buy it, and buy it he did. So let's look at what happened when Jeremiah tried to enter the city, which is recounted in Jeremiah chapter 37, verses 12 through 16. It says, Jeremiah started to leave Jerusalem to go out to the land of Benjamin to claim his portion there among the people. But when he was at the Benjamin gate, an officer of the guard was there whose name is Erijah, son of Shemaliah, son of Hananiah. And he apprehended the prophet Jeremiah, saying, you are defecting to the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans are the Babylonians, by the way. That's just another name for them. That's a lie, Jeremiah replied. I am not defecting to the Chaldeans. Erijah would not listen to him, but apprehended Jeremiah and took him to the officials. The officials were angry at Jeremiah and beat him and placed him in jail in the house of Jonathan the scribe, for it had been made into a prison. So Jeremiah went into a cell in a dungeon and stayed there many days. So what do we have here? We have Jeremiah trying to go claim his property, okay? And in the midst of doing so, he was accused by a guard of defecting to the Babylonians. In other words, Jeremiah was accused of treason. This was believable. This was believable to most people during that time because Jeremiah had prophesied Judah's destruction by way of the Babylonians for years. And when it was all said and done, Jeremiah was basically tried, convicted, and sentenced all in one day. The accusation came forth. He was thrown in jail in a dungeon, okay? Now, if you're wondering how this ended, it ended just like Jeremiah said. Judah was overtaken by the Babylonian army. The Jews were exiled, and Jeremiah, okay, he was rescued. He was rescued from prison after the government was overthrown. All right. So let's do a quick recap. Who lied? A governmental leader, an officer of the guard. What happened? Jeremiah was accused of being a traitor for delivering God's judgment messages, and he was thrown into a dungeon in a prison. What was the outcome? The outcome is he was later rescued and his words were proved to be true. Ready for the next one? All right, let's look at Nehemiah. So Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes. We don't really have a modern day context for the significance of a position like a cupbearer because we don't live in times where cupbearers really exist. But a cupbearer isn't just a person that stands between the king and death by tasting all of their food and drinking all of their drinks before the king does. But cupbearers during that time were also highly ranked administrative officials. I want you to think from a modern day context, like chief of staff to the president. That's how serious and highly ranked the position of a cupbearer was. So let me set the scene that led up to the slander of Nehemiah. So sometime after the Jews had been exiled from Judah, Nehemiah's brother ended up visiting him in Persia. So they caught up, they shot the breeze, and one of the things that Nehemiah's brother told him was about the condition of Jerusalem and the people, the remnant people that had remained there. During this particular conversation, his brother mentioned that Jerusalem's wall had been broken down and its gates had been burned. Here's why that was super important. So a city's walls were the fortification that surrounded it. The wall of a city, it plays a huge part in how secure that city is and how strong they are in withstanding an attack. The gates of a city were usually like the opening in the wall around the city. Gates were the primary means of entering and exiting a city. So closed gates would provide protection and pretty much safety for the people inside. Walls and gates are where watchmen and gatekeepers come into play. So in essence, if there is territory involved, then the owners or rulers of that territory usually have a wall and gates for its protection. That's in the natural and that's in the spirit realm as well. Some of you are watchmen and gatekeepers over spiritual territory. So the fact that Jerusalem had no walls and no gates, that deeply saddened Nehemiah because he understood the implications of it. It meant essentially that the town of his ancestors was basically exposed for anyone to do anything. So the Persian king that Nehemiah served, which was King Artaxerxes, he one day, after Nehemiah received this information, he saw how sad Nehemiah was, and he basically asked him what he wanted. So Nehemiah asked if he could go and rebuild Jerusalem. Now this was tricky. This was a very tricky request because the king actually thought that if Jerusalem was rebuilt, then the people exiled in his region would stop paying taxes. In fact, over in Ezra chapter 4, we see that the chief deputy and scribe in that region where Jerusalem was, he actually wrote the king a letter telling him that people were trying to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And they told the king that he should go and do a search. He should search his father's record books in order to see just how evil and rebellious the Jews were in the past. And that if they were to succeed in rebuilding the city, then not only would they not pay taxes, okay, but they would likely rebel and revolt against the king, just like they had done in the past. That's what the chief deputy wrote to the king. And guess what? The king agreed and he ordered the rebuilding to stop immediately. So now, sometime later after that, here's Nehemiah talking to him about this same city and about these same quote unquote rebellious people. But the king has so much respect for Nehemiah that he not only let Nehemiah go, but he sent officers and soldiers along with him. So here's where the problems start. Here's where the problems start. While in Jerusalem, Nehemiah gained some enemies, obviously, right? So the leaders of these neighboring cities, They caught wind of what Nehemiah was doing, and they were furious. They were furious. There was Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, Tobiah, the Ammonite governor, he also held a position of influence with the Persian administration of the king that Nehemiah served. And then there was Geshem, the Arabian. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 8 lets us know that these leaders, these three men, they all conspired and plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to throw it into confusion. That was their mission. When these three men heard that the wall had been rebuilt, they launched a campaign against Nehemiah. They first tried to get Nehemiah to leave his post on the wall and come down to meet them. He declined 4 times. He declined 4 times. And then on the 5th time, one of the leaders, Sanballat, he sent a letter. Here's what it said. It is reported among the neighboring nations, and Gashmu is saying that you and the Jews are planning to revolt. And that is the reason you are rebuilding the wall. And according to these reports, you are to be their king. Also, it is reported that you have appointed prophets to make a proclamation concerning you in Jerusalem, saying, there is a king in Judah. And now these things will be reported to the Persian king. There's another translation that says, now these rumors will be reported to the king. So Sanballat ends the letter saying, so come now and let us consult together. What? Like, what? How dare you? How dare you? How dare he? Are you tracking what just transpired? Because how dare he? How dare he? So let's recap. Who lied? Sanballat and the others who were opposing the rebuilding of Jerusalem's wall. And what happened? What happened is they spread a false rumor. They spread a false rumor that Nehemiah planned to rebel and crown himself king, which would put him in direct opposition to King Artaxerxes, who he served in Persia as cupbearer. What was the outcome? Well, Nehemiah, he effectively denied the allegations and the accusations. He stayed focused on God's work and he completed the wall. What could have happened is that he would have came down off that wall and he could have potentially been distracted from completing the wall or killed. All right, let's look at our final example, which of course is Jesus. I'm going to spend some time with this one, okay? Like, we're going to dig into this one because it has more components of slander than the others. These events are recounted in multiple places, but Matthew chapter 26 has the bulk of it. Here's a refresher of what happened. So right out the gate, we see in verse 3 of chapter 26 that the chief priests and the elders of the Jewish people, they got together in the courtyard of the home of the high priest and they conspired against Jesus. In this meeting, they tried to find a way to do 2 things. They wanted to arrest and kill Jesus without anyone knowing what they were doing. But let's look at this position of high priest closer, because that's what's going to give us some added perspective and context on what was really going on here. So the Greek word that's used in the original text for high priest is the word archeus. This word is used to describe high priests as being people who have great power over the state and they have significant influence in public affairs. So this is not just a church thing, okay? Like, this is a political thing as well, a community thing as well. They were a huge deal during this time. And based on scripture, for an undisclosed period of time, you have these very high-ranking officials who have gathered together with one objective that has 2 components: plan how to arrest and kill Jesus. Arrest is insufficient. They want to arrest and kill, okay? Sometime later, Judas approached these high priests. He approached them and he asked them what they were willing to give him if he turned Jesus over to them. And from that time that Judas did that, he started looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. So what Judas did is he basically dropped an access point for arrest straight into the laps of the high priest and his crew, because now they have someone who has direct access to Jesus, who's willing to hand Jesus over for arrest. That makes it a whole lot easier than them trying to do it on their own, because they know that Jesus has garnered a following. And that people love Jesus. But if you have one of his own who's going to give you the access, that makes the revolt afterwards a lot less pronounced, right? Now, we know what happens next. Judas comes back to Jesus, and he has the high priest with him, okay, and all the people. And Judas gives the high priest a sign of who Jesus was by kissing Jesus on the cheek, and Jesus is arrested. So now that they have Jesus in custody, the chief priests and the entire Sanhedrin, they move on to executing the second part of their plan, which, remember, is to kill Jesus. Now, the Sanhedrin was the highest Jewish council during this time. And even though they were under Roman occupation, the Roman governor, he still allowed them to have a very considerable amount of authority and autonomy. And now it's time for them, the Sanhedrin, to start the second part of their plan. Because as they were plotting behind closed doors, they made their objective very clear. The plan is to figure out how to arrest and kill Jesus. So as they are going into phase 2 of this plan, which is for Jesus to be put to death, they decided to do a search. And what did they search for? They searched for false testimony that would come from false witnesses. And what's false testimony? It's slander. It's a lie. It's a lie. This has to be a huge part of why God hates liars. Now, their method actually ended up using a bit of both slander and truth. So what they ultimately did was they misquoted Jesus regarding some things. And one of those things was regarding the destruction of the temple. And they used Jesus' claims as the Messiah as justification that he was lying. So the chief priests and the elders, they executed the next part of their plot and conspiracy, and they took Jesus to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate was a brutal man. Like he didn't even like the Jews. Yet the highest Jewish council, the members of the Sanhedrin, they took one of their own to him. Why? Why did they do this? Well, they did this because they needed the Roman governor for the next phase of this conspiracy. Because although they had a great deal of authority and autonomy to handle their own affairs and to, like govern and judge how they wished, it was only the Roman governor, it was only Pilate who had the authority and power of execution. So they needed to convince him. This part of their plan did not work like how they probably planned it out to work, because Pilate found no grounds for execution. But because the people demanded, incessantly might I add, that Jesus be crucified, he went ahead and gave Jesus over to them to be put to death. He basically was like, I'm washing my hands with this. Y'all do what y'all want to do. All right, so who lied? False witnesses at his trial and also members of the Sanhedrin. And then what happened? Well, religious leaders brought in false witnesses to accuse Jesus of blasphemy and of threatening the temple. And what was the outcome? The outcome was that Jesus was eventually brought before the governor, and the governor gave Jesus over to the people for them to do what they want, which was to crucify him. While ultimately it was a mixture of lies and truth that led Jesus to be crucified, the fact remains that the chief priests tried their best to rely on slander exclusively. There is a commonality in the approach of each of these examples. When analyzing the actions of the accusers in the cases of Nehemiah, Jeremiah, and Jesus, there are several striking common strategies and patterns that emerge. These examples show how opposition, especially toward godly leadership and truth, how it often uses similar tactics. In no particular order, in each instance of slander that we just looked at, that I just highlighted, the enemy implemented the following strategies. Number one, false accusations. Number two, manipulation of public perception. Number three, the use of official channels to enforce injustice or justice. Number four, targeting in the midst of righteous work. And finally, number five, pressure to stop or retreat from God's mission. Let's take a look at each one of these tactics one by one, starting with false accusations. So the false accusations were used to undermine credibility. So Nehemiah was accused of plotting a rebellion against the Persian king, and this was the king he worked for, mind you, and he was accused of trying to make himself king of Judah. Jeremiah, he was accused of treason and being a traitor. Then we have Jesus, who was accused of blasphemy, threatening to destroy the temple, and claiming to be the Son of God. So the commonality is that each person was painted in the false accusations as a political or religious threat. The false accusations used against them, they intentionally did this. False accusations that frame someone as a political or religious threat, those are highly effective tools in slander because they, number one, they exploit very deep-seated fears in those who hear the false accusations. When people hear certain things, it triggers certain emotions. Number two, they tend to provoke institutional power to respond. And then number three, the false accusations, they almost always shift the focus from truth to emotion. So let's break this down a little further. Accusations of political or religious subversion, it suggests that the individual threatens the social order. Yes, that's what it appears like. That they threaten authority or that they pose a threat to even public safety. Like these are threats that trigger emotion and reactive responses from both authorities and the public, the general public. And this matters. This matters because humans are deeply wired to protect sacred values. When someone's framed as attacking the sacred values of a person, whether they are religious norms or national loyalty, people often abandon reason and then they start to act defensively like, you ain't about to come up against this. That's what starts to happen. Labeling someone as a political or religious threat is also effective because it leverages group psychology and mob mentality. So this tends to rally the crowd, which creates like this us versus them dynamic. So the individual who's being lied on and slandered as a political or religious threat, that person ends up becoming an outsider or an enemy. And this can justify harsh treatment against them in the name of preserving unity and social norms and sacred values. And in crowds, people become highly suggestible, especially when told that their group is under attack. So this makes slander of a political or religious nature especially powerful in igniting outrage. Also, labeling someone a political or religious threat by accusing them of something like rebellion or heresy or blasphemy is effective also because it redirects the conversation from being about the message to being about the person's character. It avoids engaging with their actual ideas. Instead, it shifts the focus to their perceived identity or their perceived danger. This is the type of stuff that's done to control public perception, which involves creating emotional associations. It has nothing to do with debating facts or truth. It's all about emotions. So accusations that are tied to identity like traitor, blasphemer, liar, all that kind of stuff, like those kinds of terms, they create very lasting reputational damage, regardless of what the truth actually is. And then our other point, when labeling someone a political or religious threat, how that's effective even more is because it mobilizes institutional power. It gets the systems and the powers that be working and cooking. So when an accusation hits political or religious nerves, it often gives license to governmental or religious institutions to act swiftly. And these systems, they're designed to neutralize perceived threats, and they're designed to do that efficiently. Sometimes this is at the cost of justice. And we're going to get deeper into this in another section. Finally, labeling someone a political or religious threat is highly effective because reputation damage is very hard to reverse. Even after a person is vindicated, the stigma still lingers. Being accused of something that makes someone a political or religious threat, it sticks in the public memory more than the actual truth. Initial impressions, they create what's called cognitive anchors. And humans tend to stick with the first narrative they hear, even after it's proven false. This is why we have to keep our mouth off of people unless we hear from God about a situation, because we can end up perpetuating lasting tarnishes on a true man or woman of God's reputation, somebody that God is wanting to use for something. We can damage their reputation. This tactic shows up repeatedly in scripture. Jesus, Nehemiah, and Jeremiah were all painted as threats. Yes, it was about their message, but it was also very much so really about protecting the systems that their message challenged. So in short, false accusations work. Okay, they work. They work because they stir up primal fears of chaos, they galvanize groupthink, and they shift the focus from the ideas that a person is speaking on to that person's identity. They justify institutional suppression, and they leave long-lasting reputational damage. So let's look at the next part of the slander method that the enemy used against God's leader, which is manipulation of public perception, which goes right along with what we were just discussing. The commonality with all three accusers in our examples, they weaponized public opinion, which twisted the narrative to make the righteous person appear dangerous, heretical, or disloyal. Nehemiah's enemies tried to make the people fear that a rebellion would break out. Jeremiah's critics accused him of defecting to their enemies because that would turn the public sentiment against him and ultimately lead the people to not believe any of his prophecies. Jesus's accusers rallied the crowd, and they used religious influence to ensure that he was condemned. By the time Pilate had asked everyone like what they wanted to do with Jesus, the people in the crowd, they were already sure of their position. They were asking that a rebellious murderer be released, and they were yelling over and over and over for Jesus to be crucified. And I know we touched on public perception a little in the last tactic, dealing with false accusations, but the manipulation of public perception, okay, this and the weaponization of public opinion, these are extremely effective tools when it comes to slander. And the reason why they are so effective is because they exploit psychological biases, social pressures, and the dynamics of collective behavior. What makes these particular tactics even more effective is that they tend to create long-lasting damage, even when the accusations are false, because perception often becomes reality in the public mind. So let's take a closer look at some reasons why this method of weaponization of public opinion works. It works because people respond more to emotion than they do truth. And slander that manipulates perception is effective because emotional narratives, they overpower logic, and they overpower facts and truth. When slander triggers emotions like fear, outrage, or disgust, then people are more likely to accept it without critically examining the evidence. They're not like, well, how did this person do that? Or how do you know that this happened? Right? They don't even care about that. Then on top of that, repetition of false information, it increases the believability of it. The more often a lie is repeated in public, okay? The more it's repeated publicly, the more believable it becomes. And this is actually a phenomenon. This is a phenomenon that's known as the illusory truth effect. People who want to manipulate public opinion, they know that visibility breeds credibility, even without proof. This is why politicians repeat lies over and over and over again. You ever wonder why you get the message that somebody's a da 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 over and over and over and over again? It's because the more times you hear it, the more you're likely to believe it, even if it's false. Studies have shown over and over that repeated exposure of false claims and lies makes people believe that they're true, especially when the slander aligns with that person's pre-existing beliefs or suspicions that they already had about a person or a thing. Another reason why this is effective is because public shame is a powerful social weapon that isolates the victim. So public opinion acts as a bit of a social enforcer of sorts because it pressures other people to distance themselves from the person being accused of the wrongdoing, even if they know the truth about that person. Think about how Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Think about how he did that. When people were trying to connect him to Jesus, he was what? Distancing himself. I don't know that man. And then he ended up cussing. That's how adamant he was at distancing himself from Jesus, even though he knew the truth. Then on top of that, the person that's being accused of with the slander, they must prove a negative. Like once a person has been slandered, they're forced into this difficult position of proving what didn't happen, which is much harder and in some instances impossible. It's impossible, but it's much harder than the accuser simply making a claim. This is why our criminal justice system in America has the standard of innocent until proven guilty. A person is not always able to prove that they did not do something. Like I can't prove to you that I did not drink water this morning. How would I even begin to show that? Instead, the person accusing me of not drinking water, they need to have some evidence that I didn't drink it or that I did drink it. But the court of public opinion, they rarely wait for a defense. Slander just sticks because public perception resists change. So when used skillfully, slander that manipulates public opinion, it not only discredits the target, but it also deters others from standing with them, which makes it a potent weapon. Because instead of standing with Jesus, Peter was, he was up on out of there. All right, you ready to keep going? Because we're digging deep. All right, we'll keep going. So the next method that the enemy uses when deploying slander against true followers of Christ is one that has been used time and time again, and it is the use of official channels to enforce the injustice. The commonality between Nehemiah, Jeremiah, and Jesus is that in all of these systems of power and influence, whether those systems were political, religious, or legal, they were used to try to silence or eliminate them as targets. Nehemiah's opponents wrote an open letter to make the accusation appear official and widespread. It was read openly. Jeremiah was seized by an officer of the guard and taken before city officials, and he was judged by princes. He was judged by princes based on the slander that was used against him. That guard had no evidence. And then Jesus was tried by the Sanhedrin. Then they made it even more official by handing the Roman authorities the opportunity to solidify it. They handed Jesus to the Roman authorities with charges that were adjusted to suit their legal framework. And by Roman authorities, I mean the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. And they did this because, remember, it was only the governor who had the authority in the land to put someone to death. He had the power of execution. So the chief priests and the other church leaders, they needed to convince him to put Jesus to death legally in order for them to not be at fault. The use of systems of power and influence like government or religious institutions or legal structures, like these are effective strategies for silencing or eliminating a target, because what it does is it grants the slanderers, the liars, it grants them legitimacy, it amplifies their reach, and it essentially neutralizes resistance. Resistance is neutralized under the guise of law, order, or morality. But here's more on why this particular approach works so powerfully. So first, we have already discussed this briefly, but it adds legitimacy. Like when an accusation comes from or it's supported by an established system like a court or a church or a state legislative body, it appears more credible, even if it's false, even if it's a lie. Like in Jeremiah's case, the accusation came from an officer in the royal guard. The chief priests and the elders, they sent a mob to arrest Jesus, and he was tried by the Sanhedrin, which was the greatest council in Jerusalem, pretty much. It was composed of 71 members that included scribes, elders, prominent members of high priestly families, and the high priest, who was the president of the assembly, okay? The Sanhedrin wasn't just any council. They were the council where the most important causes were brought to be heard. Like, clock that. When a matter is heard by a tribunal as powerful as this, there is no question about the legitimacy of the verdict that they reach. Who gonna question it? Another reason why this is effective is because systems have enforcement capabilities. The use of official channels to enforce injustice is extremely effective because of this. So unlike, like regular old gossip or personal attacks, institutions can actually punish, imprison, censor, or execute. Their power is not just symbolic, it's actionable. Okay? It's actionable. This turns slander into something that has real world consequences. A lie can get someone thrown into prison like it did Jeremiah, beaten like it did Jeremiah, or beaten and killed like it did Jesus. The use of power and influence through official channels is also effective because even if people believe the target is innocent, most of them will stay silent and they will comply in order to avoid becoming targets themselves. Institutional backing causes bystanders to fall in line, and they do this out of self-preservation. And if we look a bit further, we'll also see that using official symptoms, it reframes slander as a matter of law, doctrine, or public safety. So it no longer looks like a personal vendetta. This masks things like malice and deception behind procedure, and it gives the illusion of due process. And the last thing I want to cover on why using official channels to enforce the narrative is so effective is because it creates a precedent that silences others. So when systems are weaponized against a target, it sends this message, and that message is, this is what happens to those who speak out. This is what's going to happen to you. If you do this, it puts the kibosh on any dissent that might be brewing, and in turn, it protects the accuser or the liar. It protects their position. This is one of the main goals in bringing false accusations against a follower of Christ, okay? It's to silence them and those who have the same stance as them. It's a trickle. It has been said for many years that systems of power, they often create what authors have called a narrative monopoly, which is so true. This narrative monopoly, it works. It works by discrediting or removing voices that challenge dominant interests, while also using institutional levers to maintain control. If you have the narrative monopoly, people, and you keep talking, you keep saying the same thing over and over again, people are going to believe what you say. They're going to believe what you say. Jesus was condemned by both religious, by way of the Sanhedrin, and civil governmental systems by way of the Roman government. Jeremiah was imprisoned and he was nearly executed via legal structures. Nehemiah was nearly set up through letters and false reports that were made to sound official by leaders of neighboring cities, leaders who the king trusted. They had the king's ear. Like, these examples, they show that the most effective silencing often happens not through mobs alone, but when power systems are manipulated to make evil look righteous and to make righteousness appear evil. And we know what God has to say about that. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness. All right, so let's move on to the fourth method. So the fourth strategy that the enemy used in slandering God's chosen was targeting them in the midst of righteous work. This slander came while each figure was in the middle of fulfilling God's assignment for them. Nehemiah was actively rebuilding Jerusalem's wall. Poor Jeremiah. Jeremiah was faithfully delivering God's word. He was just saying what God told him to say. Okay. And Jesus was healing, teaching truth, preparing to lay down his life for God's children. This, you know what this does? This drills home the fact that resistance often increases in the midst of obedience to God. Like, we shouldn't see resistance as a barometer for, us being off track. Like, no, that's what happens when you are on the right track often. Like, Jeremiah's message was true. He delivered the word of the Lord about Judah's destruction at the hands of the Babylonians. And the king consistently tried to silence him. And we know that Jeremiah was delivering the word of the Lord because, one, the Bible tells us. And guess what? Guess what happened? King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, he breached Jerusalem's walls. Okay, he entered the city, advanced against Jerusalem, tearing down its walls, and he laid siege to it with his entire army. Jeremiah was just delivering the word of the Lord, letting them know what's to come. And they arrested, beat, and threw this man in prison. All right. Let's take a look at the final part of Satan's slander strategy, which is his main objective, and that is the application of pressure to the person being slandered so that they will stop or retreat from God's mission. The goal was not just to ruin their name, but to derail their mission through intimidation, fear, or manipulation, or all three. Nehemiah was told to meet in the temple. That was a trap. And he was pressured to pause the work that he was doing and leading and rebuilding the wall. Jeremiah was thrown into a dungeon, isolated, and told to stop prophesying. Stop delivering the word of the Lord. And Jesus was mocked to save himself since he was the Son of God. He was also placed in the position to deny his identity, because if he said that stuff wasn't true, if he said he wasn't the Son of God, he would have been able to escape death. I think that Pontius Pilate would have let him go, which is why he kept questioning him. He's like, hey, you could just answer the question. Like, do you know what's on the other side of this for you? Now that we know this, what do we do with this information? What do we do with this? Because I'm definitely not just sharing it just because. I'm not. This is a strategy that the enemy will use and is already using. He's already using this against people who are truly doing the work of God and being the hands and feet of Jesus. Our responsibility is to internalize this information and make sure that we are not slandering and that we are not deceived by the slander. here are 2 quick tips. I'm going to hit it hard and I'm going to go. Tip number 1, be slow to judge. Nothing is what it seems. Okay? In the days to come, many things will convincingly look a certain way. So much so that the logical thinker would certainly come to the conclusion that what they are seeing is what actually is. But it won't be the case. As Jesus was being crucified, the scribes and the elders and the chief priests, they mocked him, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross and we will believe in him. Period. Let him just come down. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he takes pleasure in him. For he said, I am the Son of God." In the same way, even the criminals who were crucified with him, they taunted him. Everybody was taunting Jesus in this way. And it really looked like Jesus was not who he purported himself to be, because surely the Son of God could save himself from something as simple as crucifixion in their minds. Surely he could get himself down from here. If he be the Son of God, surely God would deliver him. That looked bad. If we were looking at that with natural eyes, that was convincing. That was a natural, logical conclusion to make, that he couldn't be what he purported himself to be, because surely that wouldn't have happened to him. Tip number 2 is to rely on the Holy Spirit. God is our guide. His Spirit lives on the inside of us, and he will guide us into all truth. God has promised us that in his word. Throughout both scripture and history, we see that slander is rarely random. It is strategic. It is strategic. The examples of Nehemiah, Jeremiah, and Jesus, they reveal a clear pattern. Slander thrives when it is framed as a threat to political or religious order. It's amplified through public perception and enforced by systems of power. These tactics are effective not because they're rooted in truth, but because they exploit human psychology. They exploit social dynamics and how we engage and interact with each other. And they also exploit institutional authority, which is there for our protection. So when a person is falsely accused of being a heretic or a liar or a traitor, the focus shifts from their mission to their perceived danger. This type of emotional framing, it makes people more reactive and less discerning. When slander is repeated and spread publicly, it activates this mob mentality in us. And what it does is it isolates the target, which is God's chosen vessel, and it deters their supporters. When institutional systems join in on the attack, they give the slander the force of law or theology or policy, or it makes resistance feel not only dangerous, but nearly impossible. These patterns are not just tactics of ancient enemies, they are timeless tools of spiritual warfare. Jesus warned us that truth bearers could be persecuted and that they would be persecuted, not always for what they do, but for what they represent. The enemy fears truth, and so he wages war through confusion, character assassination, and the corruption of justice. Yet, in every case in our example, in every case, Nehemiah's wall was completed, Jeremiah's words were proved true, and Jesus rose from the dead. So in every case in our example, God ultimately vindicated his servants. So while slander might succeed in the short term, those who remain faithful to God's call will be upheld by his hand. So in the end, truth is not just a concept. It is a person, and no lie can prevail against him.